Hello there and welcome to the channel. Today we're discussing yet another new topic, and this is actually going to be yet another new series that I'm starting for the channel. And today we're going to be discussing my top 3 picks for a used economy sedan under $25,000 in the years 2020 to 2022, the year model. And I'm basically just going to be going through kind of some of the what makes each one unique, and then some of the things that they share. And I'll be ranking them, 1 through 3. I'm going to go over 3 to 1. So if you want to know what my number 1 pick is, please stick around till the end of the video. But if you like this content and you would like to keep seeing more of it, please hit that like and subscribe button. And please feel free to leave a comment for any ideas of future categories you'd like me to cover. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So before I actually get into some of the content, I just wanted to briefly talk about this whole concept that I have. This is actually what got me wanting to start this YouTube channel. I think I mentioned this in my Missouri video, but this is actually like the idea that I had first that I wanted to film about. So these past couple videos have been leading up to me making this. So this is basically a comparison video of just the on-paper stats of these cars. Okay, so I don't have access to all 3 of these cars. I don't have the ability to just go out and drive them and tell you, this is the ride quality and the sound deadening quality and all that sort of stuff in real world MPG. I'm only going off of the paper stats of these cars. So that's kind of my little disclaimer is, take everything I'm saying with a little grain of salt. There's, of course, going to be some buyer preferences, whichever car I've put in number 3, number 2, or number 1 spot, other people might think differently. But this is just from my trying to keep it as objective as possible view of these 3 cars is how I've ranked them. And based on things like price and practicality, reliability, the main thing for me was price, and then following that is reliability, because also reliability kind of determines the cost of the car over time, and then practicality as well. So as I go through this, just if you could keep that in mind, this is simply a looking at the on paper stats of each car and kind of deciding which is the best and summing them up and comparing them. And that's what this video is about. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the number 3 car. Alrighty, coming in at number 3 is the 2020 to 2022 Toyota Corolla. And this was actually a hard decision. These cars are so close in pricing and what they come with and everything that I shuffled them around a few times before I just had to settle on, a lineup. But it pretty much came down to just, I think it's basically pricing and range. So this car, the base model LE, starts on average about $19,000 on the used market. Most of them are going to be higher mileage because these cars are daily drivers. But given it has on the LE and XLE trims, it's only a 1.8 liter 4-cylinder, making about 150 horsepower and about 130, 140 foot-pounds of torque. Not a very sporty car. They're not beat on really all that much. And from my understanding of Toyota owners, especially growing up in a family that has predominantly owned Toyotas, the servicing on these cars is usually kept fairly well up to date. If you're ever in doubt, there's usually a Carfax attached to a lot of these cars that you can check and see when the last servicing was done. But yeah, it starts about 19,000. And the SE and XSE trims and all their subsequent trim levels, like the Apex and Nightshade editions, they come with a 2-liter 4-cylinder, making just a little bit more power and torque than the LE, and getting a little bit less gas mileage. The LE gets 30 to 38. The SE versions get, I think it's like 29 to 35, and that's city highway. So this car has about a 13-gallon tank, and with that fuel economy on the LE, you'll get about 396 miles off of one tank if you're doing purely city driving, and you'll get about 500-ish miles off of one tank if you're doing highway driving. So fairly decent range, but it it's not the best range out of the three, but and not the best fuel economy, but it's still up there. This is still a economy sedan. And the thing that's nice with the Toyota is even though it does have that starting price of about 19,000 on average, they do go above or below that even on just the LE trim. But for that price, you're actually getting a fair bit of standard tech features. So this is the only one out of these three that gets both the adaptive cruise control and Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and also it gets the post collision safety system, which is basically just after you've had a collision, the car detects, if the airbags are deployed or whatever, it will deploy the brakes a little bit just to keep the car from, hopefully keep the car from having any secondary collisions after that. But it should be noted that this is the smallest out of the three. It's the shortest in length, it's the smallest in width, it's got the least height. Now, granted, it's only within a few inches, but I'm sure for a number of people that would be fairly noticeable. They do have all three very similar front seat space. It's these dimensions affect the back seat and the trunk. So this car has the least amount of legroom. If I remember correctly, it's the least amount of like headroom, shoulder room, hip room. If it does have the most on either of those, it's barely. And it for sure it has the least amount of trunk space when you have the seats up. It's about like 13.1 cubic feet. Um, and as mentioned, it doesn't have the best fuel economy. So, as mentioned, it comes down to the price, reliability, and practicality. All three of them, these are all three very reliable cars. They've had very few, reports of any major work needing to be done. Not any recalls that I could find in my research. There may have been one or two, but also these are 2020 to 2022. That's not that long ago. Um, I mean, long enough that hopefully, if something was wrong, if there was some sort of manufacturer's defect, that a recall would have been put out. But sometimes recalls can take a while. But again, so far in the data I could find, all three of them are very reliable cars. And Toyota, especially, as I'm sure most people know, Toyota kind of has a bit of a reputation for being reliable. So, yeah, that's my summary for the Corolla. Let's get on to number two. Alrighty, and moving on to our number two slot. This is going to be the 2020 to 2022 Honda Civic. And so what puts this at number two is it's a little bit bigger than the Corolla, and it gets better fuel economy on even just starting at the mid-level trim. Okay, so it starts off price wise about the same as the Corolla. It's about $19,000 to $20,000 starting price. You can find them cheaper again, but again, those will be the higher mileage ones. But I mean, again, shouldn't be too terrible. Like I said, check the Carfax, make sure it's up to date on its servicing, and more than likely, 50,000 miles on one of these is a blink in the eye of a Honda or a Toyota. So, as mentioned, though, this is larger than the Toyota Corolla. Now, granted, it does lose out on a couple tech features. So it gets the adaptive cruise control just like the Corolla, and it gets lane departure warning, but it does not get Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, and it does not get that post-collision safety system. Okay, so it doesn't have the ability to do that little applying the brakes after a collision like the Corolla does on the base model trim. Once you go up from the base model, that's where you'll start seeing these cars kind of level out with each other, and they'll be very similar. But it is longer than the Corolla. It actually has the highest amount of leg room in the rear seats, coming in at like 37.4 inches, I believe. But compared to number one, it's not a huge difference in leg room. It's only a couple inches, but then it does have less headroom, hip room, and shoulder room than the number one car. But it is also actually tied with the number one car for trunk space, roughly. It's about 15.1 cubic feet versus the 13.1 cubic feet with all the season plays. Now, the base model trim comes with a 2.0 liter four cylinder, making it's like 158 horsepower and 138 pound feet of torque. So, again, not very sporty, not very fast. It gets this actually very similar fuel economy, 30 to 38 miles to the gallon, city highway. Now, it does have a smaller tank. The Corolla had a 13.1 gallon tank. This is 12.4. So that brings your range down on the LX, which is the base trim, to 372 miles in the city and 470-ish miles on the highway. Now, if you go to the EX trim, you get a different engine. So you actually get a 1.5 liter turbocharged four cylinder. And for those of you, in case you've heard the word turbo, and usually it's accommodated with some sporty car, the 1.5 liter turbocharged four cylinder in the sedan version of the Civic is purely used to give you more fuel economy. It is not a sport tuned engine. It makes a little bit more horsepower, but it's like 20 more horsepower. It's like 170 horsepower, 150 foot-pounds of torque. So your 0 to 60 time comes down from 12 seconds to 11 and a half, like if that. So it's not crazy fast. What they're doing is the 1.5 liter. What that means is, so the liter size, for those of you who don't know, is referring to the volume of space when the piston, if you could put all the pistons down, how much empty space there is in the engine. So the 1.5 liter is half a liter smaller than the 2 liter. So they're using the turbo to make up for the fact that it's smaller, to give it that power it needs, to where you're not dropping in power going to the higher trim, but you're getting better gas mileage. The way that works is a turbo is not in use all the time. There's a couple of just quick terms I'm going to give you. There's on boost and off boost. When you are on boost, which is usually wide open throttle, maybe like half throttle at the lowest amount, but more than likely it's probably 3/4. But whenever you're on high throttle input, you're on boost. So that's when you're getting the full amount of horsepower and torque that it can give. But when you're not doing that, so say you're doing 80 on the freeway or 75, and you're just cruising there, so you're barely touching your gas pedal, you are off boost. You are not using your turbo. So at that point, your car actually comes a lot closer to being a naturally aspirated engine than a turbo engine. You're not literally naturally aspirated. There is still physically a turbo in there, and it's still between your intake and your intake valves. But it just means your turbo is not being used to make power. Okay, so, and with that, your car is not using more fuel to try and make more power. So starting at the EX trim on the sedan, you go up to 32 miles to the gallon in the city and 42 miles to the gallon on the highway, which gives you a range of like 400 miles in the city and over 500 miles on the highway. It still loses out to the number one spot, because the number one spot has a 14-gallon tank and just enough fuel economy that it just edges this out in overall range, which is part of what knocked this down to number two. But again, like I said, they're very close. You really can't go wrong with any of these cars. This is not me saying that the number one is a better car. It's just objectively on paper, that's where I had to put it. But as mentioned, it has the most leg room. So if you're someone, you only plan on ever having 4 adults in the car, and so you don't really care about the shoulder and hip room because you're not trying to cram it full. This does have the most leg room. It is, for taller people, it is going to be a little more comfortable sitting in the back. Although granted, then there's also the headroom. But it's kind of pick your poison at this point. So yeah, that's my summary of things on the Honda Civic. And again, also very reliable car. Um, very few, negative things said about it in terms of reliability in this generation and even the new generation, because actually 2022 is the 11th generation, which is not shown here. But and also, um, since I forgot and I'm just now remembering, these cars also all do score fairly well on their safety tests, from what I could see. Now, I did not see the real world safety data on these cars, so I cannot speak for that. But what I have seen, I'm sharing with you. So let's move on to number one. And coming in at number one is the 2020 to 2022 Kia Forte. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I'm just going to say Forte for now, but if that is butchering it, please feel free to correct me in the comments. But without further ado, the reason for this being number one, again, it was a hard choice. It was not originally number one when I was, doing my research. But as I was researching these cars and trying to keep it as objective as possible, I had to put it at number one because I was just like, so it starts the FE, which is the base model trim for this car, starts on average about $16,000. Now, if you remember, I was saying for the other two, they're starting, 18, 19, 20,000 on average. So they're a couple $1,000s more than this, and especially and that's like why the Corolla is in third place. The Corolla starts $2,000 to $3,000 more expensive, but it's actually a smaller car than this by not a huge amount, but it is smaller. This is about the same size as the Civic, actually a little bit more space inside. This has 15.3 cubic feet of trunk space with all the seats in place. The Civic only gets 15.1 cubic feet. This actually does lose to the Civic in leg room for the rear seats by about 1.5 inches, but it does win out on headroom, shoulder room, and hip room. So if you're trying to fit 3 people in the back, if you're a college student and you're trying to bring 4 of your friends along, this has, I would say, pretty much the best backseat room, unless you're trying to sit 4 really tall people in the back. But if they're, average size, 18, 19, 20-year-olds or 21-year-olds, you should, this will possibly be the most comfortable given the extra headroom, shoulder room, and hip room compared to even the Civic, which basically means, they're not going to feel like they're all scrunched up against each other in the car. But this has a 2.0 liter 4-cylinder making about 147 horsepower and 132 pound-feet of torque. So it does not have the best fuel economy. That goes to the Civic. The Civic has the best fuel economy. This has the best range. So the Civic has a 12.4 gallon tank, as mentioned. This is a 14-gallon tank. Combine that 14 gallons with a 30 mile to the gallon MPG in the city and 38 miles to the gallon on the highway, and you get about 434 miles in just city driving, and like 530 or 540 miles on the highway. The Civic is just a little below that, but the Civic still gets a respectable range, when you have that 1.5 liter turbo. And if it's, if you're not trying to just get the absolute max amount of range between fill ups, the Civic is actually going to save you money on gas a little bit compared to this. But besides that, it's also both this and the Civic can get, either manual or CVT. The Corolla, the only way to get a manual is on the SE Apex, I think the regular SE, and maybe the XSE. But the reason they do it is, again, it's not for sportiness. It's not for, oh, cool, like driving experience. It's for money. So The manual versions of these cars, when new, typically sold for a couple thousand cheaper than the CVT, just because a manual is it's a simpler transmission to make. But yeah, so it's, you might have some if you're someone who knows how to drive manual, or maybe you're just interested in learning manual. In which case, learning manual on a car like this is, I would say, probably the way to go. It's low horsepower, so it's going to be forgiving because everything's going to be a little bit softer. And also, manufacturers on these newer cars that have manuals, they're putting rev match. So what that is all that means is when you downshift, it automatically brings the revs up to where they need to be so that you're not burning out your clutch. I had to learn that lesson the hard way, just as a quick side story. My first car was a 2006 Scion XB, and the thing I was taught, at least initially growing up, and I know for those of you who are watching who are car guys and who know better, you're going to cringe when you hear this, but my dad taught me to slowly let the clutch out as I downshifted so that it would act as a brake. And over time, it got to the point where I couldn't downshift into second when I was moving at speed. So I was hurting the clutch, and I feel bad about it to this day. But for most people, I'm sure you're going to want the CVT version of this car. And another interesting thing to note on this is, so all these cars, when you go up from the base model trim, they get the alloy wheels. The base model trims all have the steel wheels with the hubcaps. Once you go up from the base trim, they lose the steel wheels. They get the alloy ones, and they get stuff like leather seats, the full safety system. If it's like Honda Sense or Toyota Safety Sense or whatever they call it, they get the full safety suite, like rear cross traffic alert and um, like emergency automatic braking, where the car will start to apply it has like a radar sensor and it'll start applying the brakes for you if it detects a collision coming. Um, they get stuff like leather seats, heated seats, I think like heated steering wheels. They actually all get heated mirrors from what I saw on the base trim, but this one is the only one that gets ventilated seats on the top trim. So if that may be another thing to consider if you're living somewhere that's a little hotter. Um, Having ventilated seats, as I understand it, it like blows air through the seats to help keep you cool in the front seat. So just something to consider for this car. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about on this car specifically, and all the differences between these cars. But now I just would like to kind of cover slash maybe recap some of the similarities between these three cars, and kind of cover again why, like, yes, this is the number one car on this list, on my list, but why there's really not a whole lot of space separating these cars on this list. Like, I know we tend to go like, well, it's number one, it must be the best. These cars are so close, they're almost tied with each other for number one, but it's just, like I was saying, there's a few things that separate them. So let's go ahead and get into the similarities. Alrighty. And here we find ourselves at the closeout of the video. So just to kind of summarize some of the similarities between these cars, they are all, as mentioned, these are economy sedans. They're not particularly big cars, so they're going to have an easier time navigating like tighter spaces. You're going to be able to park them in compact parking spots. They all have, pretty good fuel economy and range. They're all, they all start below $20,000 and kind of go up from there. But because of that, it does give you a lot of choice. Okay, so I think for example, the Corolla LE, there's like over 300 of them on the used market right now, at least with the software that I use. But they all start in the base model trim. They all have cloth seats, no heating or cooling on the seats, single zone climate control. They're They're all front wheel drive. They all have, these smaller, more economical engines that have less power. They all have a CVT, which is, I mean, I'll call it automatic, but there is a difference between CVT and automatic. I'll probably make another video going in depth on that, but um, pretty much these are the similarities. They all have, touch screens at this point. It's not like one of them doesn't have a touch screen. They all have backup cameras, which is used. I mean, even though these cars tend to have pretty decent rear view visibility, it is nice having a backup camera. Um, but yeah, I mean, they're probably not going to win beauty contests, but they, in my opinion, they look nice enough to, they. I would hope you're not embarrassed to have one of these as a first car. Okay, if if you were somehow getting like a Fiat Multipla or a Pontiac Aztec as your first car, I could understand. Okay, but these cars are, and compared to some of the ugliest cars out there, they're certainly not ugly. They all have daytime running lights, projectors, in some cases like LED headlights, which are pretty bright. LED brake lights, I think, in some cases, and sometimes, LED blinkers, which just tend to be brighter than your incandescent ones, but even incandescent bulbs are well bright enough. But yeah, these are pretty much my three picks. There's actually a lot more cars in this segment, but I had to bring it down to three. Some of the other honorable mentions is like the Optima, which I think is Kia, the Hyundai Sonata, the Accord, the Camry. But it was just with some of those, it was the price. So the Accord and the Camry, yeah, you can find them for under 25,000, but you're not going to find very many, and it's pretty much you're going to be limited to the lowest trim level. So I wanted to pick something that would give you guys a little more flexibility, on if you wanted to spend a little bit more and get something with a few more features, or if you just really, if you're just looking to save as much money as possible, then they're as cheap as possible. But yeah, if you enjoyed this content and you really liked it, I would appreciate, a like on the video and a subscribe. And I hope to see you guys again in the next video. Thank you and have a great day.